When we come to analyze what homeostasis means, we come to understand that it's a relatively stable and dynamic steady state of the body, a type of steady state where the body prefers to be in a special setting in order for it to function appropriately. And it maintains that with 3 different types of mechanisms. The first of them being a sensor, then an integrator, followed by an effector. And the sensor basically senses any changes that may be detrimental to the body. It integrates it with appropriate body systems to bring a certain effect that restores the level back to that homeostatic balance. And there are many different types of homeostatic phenomena that occur in the body, but in this video we'll discuss 3 of them in order to get a basic overview of homeostasis. But before we begin, let's discuss what the term means. Homeo means the same, and stasis means not moving. And this implies that that special system that it prefers to be in doesn't really like to change as much. So let's look at 3 examples that will help paint the picture in better detail. Let's look at temperature. And you might ask, well, what's the norm? The normal temperature of the human body is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And there's 2 clinical significances that are associated with temperature. The first of them being hypothermia. And the second being hyperthermia. Hypothermia is just basically another way of saying that there is a decrease in core body temperature. And hyperthermia, there will be an increase in core body temperature. And in hypothermia, well, you might ask, well, how can we restore this? Well, there's a behavioral change that becomes set in play. In hypothermia, we tend to wear warm clothes. And we also go into fetal position because it helps us to reduce skin surface to the cold. And then you might ask, well, physiologically speaking, what happens? Well, there's sympathetic nerves that will constrict blood vessels. And then you might ask, well, what's the significance of that? Well, it's to keep blood away from the surface and to minimize heat loss from the skin. And as you minimize heat loss, you'll help aid the hypothermia, the low blood temperature levels. And don't forget shivering. We also shiver in order to generate heat, to warm up. In hyperthermia, we tend to seek the shade. And there's cholinergic sympathetic nerves which stimulate sweat glands. And as we sweat, we undergo evaporative cooling so that when our sweat evaporates, it leaves off a cooling sensation on the skin and the blood underneath. And in this situation, we'll undergo vasodilation. And when we vasodilate the vessels, it allows the blood to flow near the surface and heat is lost. And when you lose heat, you cool the body. So we've discussed what becomes sensed, and that involves the temperature-sensitive receptors that respond to temperature, changes in temperature, and that it gets integrated with the hypothalamus, which is responsible for detecting changes in temperature. And then what becomes restored is in the way that the sympathetic nerves either vasoconstrict or vasodilate. So let's move on. We've discussed temperature. We can go on to discussing blood glucose. So then you might ask, well, what is the norm blood glucose level? Well, it depends, because before a meal in a patient without diabetes, it's about 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter. And after a meal, it's about roughly 140 milligrams per deciliter. And there's two clinical significances that can occur with this. Either you have hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia. Hypoglycemia is indicated by a decrease in blood sugar. Hyperglycemia is an increase in blood sugar. And then you might ask, well, how does the body deal with this? Well, in the pancreas, you have what are known as alpha cells. In these alpha cells, they'll secrete glucagon. And the glucagon basically readjusts the decrease in blood sugar. And it does it by inhibiting B cells from secreting insulin. And in hyperglycemia, you have beta cells. And in the beta cells, they'll secrete insulin. And it also inhibits alpha cells from secreting glucagon. And that's how you will readjust the sugar levels in the blood. So what becomes sensed? They're the alpha and beta cells. They detect changes in blood sugar, and then becomes integrated. In future subsequent videos in which we'll discuss diabetes, we'll talk about how there's a dysfunction in the beta cells in response to insulin, and how that leads to high glucose levels. What becomes integrated are the liver, fat cells, and muscle cells. So then you might ask, well, how do we restore it? There's two processes. The first, in terms of hypoglycemia, we have a process known as glycogenolysis. And since our blood sugar is too low, we want to create glucose. So we do that by breaking down the glycogen in the body into glucose. And in hyperglycemia, we undergo a process called glycogenolysis. And it takes the excess glucose that we have and transforms it into glycogen. So now that we've discussed temperature and blood glucose, let's move on to ionized calcium. Now, calcium is the major component of minerals in the body. And the norm is about 8.8 to 10.4 milligrams per deciliter in adults. And we have about 99% calcium stored in bones. And there's two major clinical significances that can occur. Either you have hypocalcemia or hypercalcemia. In hypocalcemia, you've got a decrease in calcium levels. In hypercalcemia, you have an increase in calcium levels. So what happens when you have low calcium levels? Well, you stimulate a gland known as the parathyroid gland. And its job is to secrete its own hormone, known as parathyroid hormone. And once it's secreted in response to low calcium, it will stimulate a bone cell known as osteoclasts. And their main job is to basically resorb the bone. And when it resorbs the bone, it deposits calcium into the blood, since there's less calcium in the blood. And when there is an increase in calcium, in this situation, what becomes stimulated is the thyroid gland. And it secretes its own hormone, known as calcitonin. And calcitonin works on a particular bone cell called osteoblasts. And osteoblasts build the bone. And well, you might ask, well, how does it build the bone? Since there's an increase in the calcium, it uses the excess calcium to deposit it into the bone. So what becomes sensed there? So the parathyroid gland and the thyroid gland. And what becomes integrated was the bones. And we'll discuss further in subsequent videos how calcium is regulated in the body and then becomes restored by parathyroid hormone and calcitonin. And those are three ways in which the body undergoes homeostasis in order to re-establish that special state in which it prefers to be in